over time, it'll
So if you go.
maybe walk a little bit more. I know. I've never seen this one. Utility.
Okay. Let's go ahead and call to order the November 17th, 2025 Tipton Utility Service Board meeting. The first item on the agenda are the minutes from the previous meeting.
I move they be approved as submitted.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve the minutes from the last meeting. Any discussions, comments? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. We'll move on to claims.
Make a motion, we pay claims 27,189 through 27,236 for 1,453,104.88.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve claims as submitted. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. We're down to the charge-off report, sir.
Yep, so I sent out the information late last week. As was mentioned at the last board meeting, I think this month and next month will be a little healthier than normal. And it'll set us up for 2026 with a pretty good cleaner slate, not totally clean. But the biggest one this month was close to $4,000 of the 7,000 total. And that was a personally worked with closely for several years, and just, you know, we got behind with her, and she never could catch up despite all the assistance that she reached out to different folks in the community, and just one of those. And the rest of them are more of the customary, left us hanging with their last bill when they left town, and that's about 2 months worth of bills for each one of those. So, but the trending's still better, and I think the tracking we're doing, thanks to Lori and Peters, giving us new insights and pointing out, I think, positive outcomes here this year in 2025.
Total still continues in the right direction delinquency wise.
Yep.
Anybody else have any comments about the charge-offs? Seeing none, I welcome a motion for approval.
Make a motion that we approve the charge-offs as submitted.
Second.
Okay, I've got a motion and a second to approve charge-offs as submitted. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. We are up to you, sir.
So I'm gonna go through my normal customary items, and then we'll save the balance of the meeting for our friend Brandon from Cronin Associates. We'll talk sewer and water rates after that. So you'll indulge me for a few minutes, Brandon. Go to the order. I sent out the 2026 holiday trouble truck and utility board meeting schedule, and we'll soon post that meeting schedule in our entryway at the utility office, as well as get it updated on our website. And that suffices to meet our legal requirements of notification of our meetings. We do have safety training upcoming this Wednesday. And we looking at some project updates. Our backup wash pump is installed and electrified, and we have an official startup and commissioning session on Thursday with the pump vendor and our SCADA control folks. So we'll get that up and running. And that really will wrap up everything out west in terms of the water system out there, and sets us up for success in the future, including the water tower, the backwash, and it'll also provide us the ability to clean our current holding tank that's on the ground that's not been cleaned since commissioning in 2008 or 9, whenever that water plant went on. We weren't able to bypass it, but now the water tower allows us to do that, so. Unincorporated areas, I heard at the county commissioners meeting that progress is being made at Doctors Park. The county's handling the daycare center and their septic issues there. They're getting ready to hook up. Matt, you might share us any updates. You're ready to order some equipment probably.
Yeah, they're getting close. We've got, our design is effectively complete. We got our IDIM permit last week, I think on Friday. We have to get a permit from IDNR because it's in the floodway. It's a marginal amount of construction, so we don't anticipate a problem there. We have not gotten approval from the IDIM land management people, which they're the ones who have to sign off because it's in a historic landfill. I expect that to be forthcoming pretty soon. But yeah, we're working. We'll probably be sending out RFPs to contractors either sometime this week or early next week to get construction moving. So it'll probably take 2-3 months at least, I would assume once we get a contractor on board, just getting equipment and all that sort of thing.
So currently the daycare hauls their sewage out of their septic tank to our wastewater plant. And we cut them a pretty good deal to help, lessen the blow on the daycare. So they have to pay to haul it and they have to pay us a certain amount to treat it. And we're working with them on that. They will continue doing that until the project comes online. So. One thing of note out west, I don't know if anyone paid attention to the county planning meeting a couple weeks ago, but a new Speedway gas station is being planned on Campbell Crossing, directly west of the Love's truck stop. And I've been in touch with the design engineer contractor, and they're sending their plans to us for review. Everything looks in line as far as the utilities. Remember, we serve water and wastewater west of 31, but not electrical. That's Duke Energy Electrical. So I think pending any issue, they'll be out there starting construction pretty soon. So add a customer to the fleet for TMU. And then city, county, utility, we've talked about the task force for several months now. Kind of the latest two things. We and the mayor sent a draft response back to the county, a month ago, several weeks ago. And I think they're still massaging and chewing on that. In the meantime, mayor and met with one of the county commissioners, and they said, hey, let's continue with our agreement to work together on commercial industrial opportunities outside the city limits. And they agreed to do that. And also we felt like it would be good, just put that in writing. I think the mayor, you can add to that, but you've got a letter you have sent or will soon send. It just says, hey, we want to continue that partnership.
Yeah, correct. Mostly in the spirit of how we've gotten to this point already, that folks who are making decisions, maybe even some of you who made those initial investments, we're going to reaffirm to that we want to see those initial investments pan out, return that investment back to the community. So we're just reaffirming that we want to stay committed working together until we can figure out some of the complexities. Let's continue just to work together and to achieve success.
And then we will get together 2 weeks from now, December 1st, and Kurt Hare has agreed to join us for that meeting. Kurt used to be in the office right across the street. He has now moved. There's no Edward Jones sign on that building. But he's moved in with his brother and I think another partner down the road. But Kurt helps us with our 457 plan, our retirement plan at the utility. I believe he does the same thing for the county. At any rate, we try to have him come in once a year and just talk about the state of the financial industry and the state of our plans. So we'll probably chat with Kurt for 15 minutes or so next meeting.
Very good.
Yep. That's all I got. Anybody have any questions for me before we turn it over to Brandon? Yes, Rick.
Any update on East Street?
East Street. I saw last week, they were putting down, looked like the final bit of stone to get ready for paving. They're quickly running out of paving time, but I think they've assured the mayor that they would get the paving done.
Cool.
It's not done yet.
Definitely running out of time.
Yeah, that's been a little bit of a challenge for many people in many different ways, but I think we can see the finish line. And I think we're very pleased that the final result, it took a little longer than we had hoped over on West Street, but if you drive down West Street, you see it's a really nice asset to the community.
Anything else from the board for Jim before we turn it over to Brandon?
So Brandon Barthel with Cronin Associates, you might remember Brandon from a couple of years ago when we did our electrical rate study. So when we start talking about rates, the first thing we do is just study our current situation and where we're at. He looked back a few years at our financial results for water and city sewer here in the east plant, nothing out west, here in the east, and give us a good understanding of where we stand and what we might consider recommendation-wise for rates moving forward. And there's several different scenarios that he'll go through. But Randy, you can take it from there and describe the situation even better.
Thank you. As Jim said, I'm Brandon with OW Cronin Associates. I'm working with Tipton here for a few years now, electric side. Also work on those quarterly tracking factors that you guys see as well. And then we've got financial information that dates back
Is that
to
mic on? I don't know if we checked that.
green.
Yeah.
There it is, down is.
Goes back to about 2019, so we've got a good amount of data that we've looked at. But for our rate study, east plants only for water and wastewater, looking at 2023, 24, and then we took a 6-month cutoff in 25 and 24. So really just a pretty recent, lot of data there, and we'll go over our findings of the rate studies and kind of some of those different scenarios that Jim had talked about. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit of history here in the water and sewer rates in Tipton, and then some notes there in Indiana code. So the current water rates were last adjusted in 2022, and that was actually a rate reduction. There was a utility receipts tax repeal that was included in there. Basically all water utilities in the state of Indiana had to reduce their rates by about 1.4%.
And electrical.
And electrical and gas. That did not apply to wastewater. But the actual last rate increase for water was closer to 2019. So it has been about, looking at 2026 here, just in a couple months. It's been about 7 years since that last increase. For 4,000 gallons, that is the metric that we use to kind of see where a residential bill is. And that's basically an industry standard, a statewide average for a residential bill, might be more or less. And this is converted from cubic feet to gallons. So we're looking at $20.50 for 4,000 gallons of water, which I would say is some of the cheapest water in Indiana. I've done a lot of these rate studies, and we've got a lot of data on these, different utilities. And I will say that $20.50 is very low. Current sewer rates, on the other hand, were last adjusted in 2011, but it looks like the last effective rate increase was back in 2015. I didn't see the ordinance, but I'm imagining there was some sort of phase-in approach that probably happened around that time. $41.53 for 4,000 gallons of usage. I would say not quite as low as water, but still definitely, under the averages of what we see with other utilities.
So we use our water meters to measure what goes through the residence or business, and that same consumption is used for both water at $20 and wastewater at $41.50.
Yep.
On the utility.
Indiana code lays out the revenue requirements for utilities. Chapter 8 is water and chapter 36 is sewer, and basically states that rates are fair, equitable, just, those kinds of phrases. If the rates are sufficient to cover those revenue requirements that are listed there, operating expenses, debt service on bonds or requirements related to those bonds, working capital, and depreciation. So kind of using this as a guideline for our pro forma, this not all these line items will necessarily apply to both utilities, some to water, some to sewer, but just kind of gives you an idea of where that all comes from and kind of, moving forward. Just wanted to make note of that. Here are our overall recommendations for water and wastewater before we get into some of the numbers on the pro forma schedule. So water, we're providing allowances for anticipated increases in operating expenses and depreciation funding. We're proposing $26 for 4,000 gallons would be the average bill that it comes out to. We're also recommending to increase availability fees based on calculation of plant value divided by EDUs or equivalent dwelling units. Basically, we have taken all the customers and converted those customers to an EDU based on a 5/8 inch meter. So where a 2, 3, or 4 inch meter has a ratio that relates to that 5/8 inch meter. And then basically this is going to be a fee that currently exists, but we're recommending an increase there for any future connections so that they can buy into the existing water system. So while this wouldn't affect any of your current customers, other than the fact that they would benefit from future customers who are buying into a system that already exists. And this is basically an equity-based approach.
Just to be clear, you're talking about the availability and connection fees wouldn't impact our current customers, but the
That is
recommended rate increase would be across the board. So
That is correct.
Okay.
On the wastewater side, similar in water, providing allowances for increases in operating expenses and depreciation funding. There are also bonds outstanding on the wastewater side, so those requirements are taken into consideration as well. Showing two options here, I'd say proposed is more where you're at today or here soon, and then the bond issue, we're using $5 million as a placeholder to basically show, what's on the horizon, what's to come for the city of Tipton if, a wastewater project does, come to fruition. So $52.02 for 4,000 gallons, whereas the bond issue there's probably add about $7 or $8, to that proposed option. Just kind of depends on some different variables, but for discussions today, this gives you a good understanding of, what that might look like. We are also recommending increases to Sharpsville and Kempton wholesale treatment customers on the wastewater side. This is because their revenues and expenses are included in the calculation. Therefore, they are treated on an across-the-board basis, the same as the rest of the customer base. Also recommending increases to availability fees and connection fees on wastewater side. I did review connection fees on water and sewer. I felt that the water felt more reasonable, but on the wastewater side, I felt that there could be an increase from $1,000 to $1,500 to cover the cost of the connection, which would get it in more line with closer to what water has. I believe they're at $1,300 for 5/8. And then again, on the availability fees, it's a similar calculation where we take the meter sizes and then convert that to EDUs so that we can figure out what each customer's buy-in to the plant would be. Look at a couple slides here on water, and then we'll look at a couple slides on sewer to wrap it all up. But here's the pro forma on the water side. So those three lines at the top are the revenue requirements that I had discussed previously. Operating disbursements or expenses, and then we also have debt service on outstanding bonds, which equals 0 because the 2010 bonds in the water utility just recently paid off. And then the depreciation or working capital that's going to provide funding for future capital outlays. The depreciation fund at the end of June was somewhere in the tune of $428,000. So I would say that's probably good for a year or two. So without an increase, if operating costs continue to increase and you're spending your normal amounts on depreciation, I would imagine that balance would start to dwindle. So I do think that the depreciation funding is very crucial here in this calculation. The rate adjustment for an average water bill, if you increase the rates by an equal percentage every year for 7 years, it would have been about an 80-cent increase. I'm kind of looking at where the rates were versus where they would be in 2026 with this recommendation. Obviously, utility it's very unlikely or not very common to where utilities are looking at the rates every single year. There are some that do that, but typically it's maybe every 3 or 4 years would be a good recommendation. But nonetheless, rates last as long as they last until the costs or the costs catch up or the growth doesn't sustain it. So that's kind of where we're at now.
On the capital side for water, so the last project we did was in 2012, and that's the bond issue we just recently paid off. My crystal ball doesn't show any major capital investments in the next 5 years, but there is some older equipment out there and pumps and things that, tend to not last forever, and we get surprises every once in a while. And then we also have the 5 wells that we spend anywhere from 30 to 50 grand a year on one well this year, and then we move through the system and refurbish and rehabilitate the wells. Try to get them once every 8 years, so not quite every year, but we're going to spend 30 to 50 grand. That kind of is the only capital expenditure that I can foresee.
Mhm.
And the water capacity, that's basically a 2 million gallon a day plant, and our current customer base is using about 8 to 900,000 gallons a day. So we have plenty of capacity. We have the 2 water towers that we have a program of maintenance for those as well. So I don't anticipate coming back here and saying, hey, we've got to do a project at the water plant.
This doesn't do anything in the west plant.
Correct, that's separate. West plant's newer, in good shape. We got to do some things out there, but nothing extraordinary.
Yeah, Bernard, just a couple comments on that. Our report only analyzes the revenues and expenses of East. While we did look at West just to kind of make sure that things are making sense out there at all, the numbers all jive to where we didn't feel that we didn't push Jim on any recommendations there. So West looked good from our analysis, and just a couple more comments here on water. The operating costs have been increasing over the last few years, somewhere in the tune of, on the low end, 80,000, on the high end, 110,000. So we have seen some pretty significant increases in water local costs here moving forward, from the last few years. And then something I did not mention that's not on the slide is that hydrant fee. That is included in the calculation. It's metered sales and fire protection, which probably includes hydrant fees and the automatic sprinkler charges. So when you look at your rate schedule in your rate study, you'll see a same percentage increase across those line items. And then the availability fees, as I mentioned, were treated a bit differently. They're not affected by this revenue and expense calculation, but they're treated similarly, a separate calculation there. And then just kind of to note on hydrant fees, as we look forward at the comparison with other communities, this does not include hydrant fees. And I didn't believe that it would make sense because some of these communities charge hydrant fees to their customers. Other communities collect it from the general fund, which is from property taxes that the customers would pay anyway. So it's kind of 2 methods of collecting that money. Nonetheless, here we're just looking at 4,000 gallons of water usage. Even with an increase in that monthly bill of $5.50, again, we haven't seen an increase in the water utility rates in almost 7 years. It would still provide a lot of depreciation funding, and that's going to be very helpful for the utility moving forward. It's going to cover your operations. Fortunately, those bonds are paid off and don't have to worry about that anymore. And then still, gives Tipton very reasonable and very competitive water rates compared to others in Indiana. Some of these that kind of stick out to me are, Frankton, Atlanta. They're not too far away. They're paying almost $80 a month for the same amount. Kind of moving down the list. Indiana American Water, that's going to cover Sheridan and Noblesville and a whole slew of communities in Indiana. They recently had some very extensive investment in their plants. That's where their rates are. They recently had a rate increase over the last few years, and that's Noblesville. That's where I'm paying. And then we've also kind of moving down there, Whitestown, just up the road there, and they're a booming community, Whitestown, and their rates are still kind of in the tune of almost $40 a month. And there's some outliers as well. Elwood and Alexandria, their rates seemed a bit outdated. I've done a lot of research on those, and those were increases from 2014 and 2017 specifically. So if I missed some of those, I would say that those are ones to keep in mind as well. That if they haven't had an increase in quite some time, then they're likely due for one. BT study, that's the one right above the Tipton proposed, Baker Tilly, another firm that does, works in utility rates. They put out a study at the end of the year, and that is an amount that reflects 3,000 to 6,000 population. 3,000 to 6,000 population is the range, and that's the average that they came up with for 4,000 gallons from. Not sure what their sample size is, but they're a very reputable firm. I felt that it would make sense to include that in here as well, just to kind of see where a similar sized community. I think Tipton's population is somewhere over 5, less than 6. Yeah, so figured that'd be a good one there as well. So, are there any questions on water at this point, before we kind of look at similar schedules for wastewater?
I'll bring Matt in for sure on wastewater management. Is there anything on the water side that sticks out to you?
I don't think so. I think the only thing I would note is just, I'm curious about how you calculate the depreciating fund.
Mhm.
And I also think it's worthwhile to note that that's actually built into your rates so that as stuff deteriorates, you have the money to fix it. And I think that helps forestall like major capital expenses over time. Yep. So
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely our recommendation to build up that depreciation fund over time and then spend it down as improvements are needed or projects arise. What we did for depreciation fund is we tried to find a balance between that ending rate and also previous years of payments. Also kind of looking at depreciation expense, which doesn't always necessarily align with your cash capital expenses. But just, I guess, a trio of those three things, and felt that the 362.5, or I think that's what we used here for water, or 384.5, the other number was for wastewater. But that's kind of how we came up with that, and kind of some considerations is that, if an increase doesn't occur, your operating costs are what they are. I mean, give or take, some percentage points. Those costs won't go away. You don't have bonds outstanding water, so there's no cost there. And then depreciation is usually the first one to go, and it's a bit of a balancing act there of more funding up front is going to help save costs and headache in the long term, but the trade-off for that is a bit of an increase now, or here in the next 6 months to a year. Just kind of some different considerations to be made. And I think that it's also important to note that with depreciation funding, it does help save interest costs in the long run, where if your customers pay a bit more here in the next 5-10 years for depreciation, that's going to help buy down projects to where that's typically the cycle of water and wastewater equipment and infrastructure. It goes through a cycle of all these communities need this money, and they borrow all the money, and the rates go astronomically high. And then there's other communities that are able to, I would say, there's planning involved, but there's also just luck of the draw of what works and what doesn't. That's a long-winded way of saying that, if you're funding your depreciation up front, then that's going to help save interest costs in the long run. You don't have to borrow as much on those projects.
So it's more like a capital fund, Jim? Is that the way we view it? And a utility, a nonprofit? Because when I think of depreciation from a entity, it's money that you've invested and it's a tax benefit, I guess. So it's kind of...
Yeah, it's just a mechanism of, with utility, financial, bookkeeping and accounting. Just think of it as one big bucket of money is going to be all your water funds, and there's a separate amount for wastewater, and then basically there's individual areas or smaller buckets for each of those different funds. And it's just it's a prescribed way of accounting in Indiana. I think it does make sense because it helps planning for the future, similar to a bond and interest fund where you're storing away money and then you're making your payment, and it's a cycle similar to depreciation as well. You're funding that over time, and then maybe you only have $100,000 to $150,000 in one year, but then you might have $500,000 or $600,000 the next, and then it all kind of evens out.
Yep, good deal.
All right.
On the wastewater.
On the wastewater, so there are some similar situations here in wastewater, also different. I'll mention. So just kind of looking at those line items at the top: operating disbursements or expenses, debt service on outstanding bonds, debt service on proposed bonds, and then allowance for working capital and depreciation. So looking at these financial statements, we did not see as many increases on the wastewater side and costs. I do believe it's a bit of an anomaly. I would expect increases moving forward. It did go down one year and then it went up the next year. So something else that we consider when we're putting together our budgets for water and wastewater operating costs is we try to hit a target or budget that's going to be good for 3 to 4 years. Kind of goes back to that recommendation I said, it'd be best to look at your rates every 3 to 4 years. We don't want to give you, 1 year of inflation if you're going to do it. If you're going to, do an increase or, pass on an increase, then it would make sense to try and create a budget that's going to be good for a few years. So while it is a significant jump from the test year, that 1.668 million, that's kind of just a bit of background as to how we got to that number using inflation and just looking at historical costs as well as where we kind of see trending from our side with the firm, just looking at other communities in the state of Indiana. Outstanding bonds, the 2015 revenue bonds and refunding bonds, 2 issues that add up to about $334,000 a year. Those are at 0% interest, so it doesn't get any better than that other than free money. And then the variable here amongst these 2 columns proposed in $5 million bonds is hence the $5 million bonds. We're looking at 5% for 20 years. 20 years is typically a standard term length for a utility bond. And we believe that 5% is a reasonable assumption for these conversations, just to see, while we're looking at where you're at now and where you might be here in a few years, also want to consider, what kinds of projects might be out there on the horizon. So
We can speak to that now. Matt and I have kind of stated, Matt, I know we agree that the clarifiers are 45 years old and.
Yeah, I would say for the most part, the wastewater plant's in reasonable condition. I mean, the project we did about 10 years ago with Bowen went through a lot of the unit processes. The main one it didn't is the secondary clarifiers. Those are basically tanks with 35-foot diameter mechanisms in them that settle water out. Most of those mechanisms were put in, 3 of the 4 were put in the early 80s. We've gotten proposals and they're steel and moving parts and motors and gearboxes and all that sort of stuff. So they probably need to be replaced sooner rather than later. We've got a couple different budgetary costs that have ranged between probably $250,000 to $400,000 per unit, and that's just for the equipment. So then you'd have to have a contractor come in and demo the old, install it, paint it, whatever. So it's probably looking at maybe a couple $1 million or something like that by the time it's all said and done. The other thing is the blowers at the wastewater plant. You probably need 1 or 2 more of those. Those probably are $100,000 a piece to buy, and then you have to install them and whatnot. Those are a bit more of a plug and play sort of item. You've got the piping they connect to and the pads that they sit on in the building that they are in, and the electrical connections and all that are there. You just need to take the old out and put the new in. The third thing that I mentioned to Jim is the electrical switchgear at your plant it was put in the early 1980s. It's in your old inflow pumping station, which was built in the 1930s. It's below the 100-year flood elevation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So all the electricity that comes in that powers the various pumps and clarifiers and ultraviolet equipment and this.
Yeah, it's in a precarious location.
Yeah.
So probably what you should, and now it's been there for 45 years and nothing bad has happened yet. So I don't want to be a doomsayer, but probably moving that up to your administration building, which is on higher ground, is a good thing to do again at some point in time. I don't exactly know, that's probably $1 million or less for doing that. I think the actual equipment is between $100,000 and $200,000. Hiring electricians to run wire and all that stuff, especially on the wastewater side, isn't cheap. So, and then the final thing I had mentioned to Jim was the utility over time has done some sewer rehabilitation projects. We did one with the Phase 3 sewer project. I know there have been some specific ones. I think probably 10 to 15 years ago, they did one in the vicinity of the library because there was a sewer that ran under a building and some of the stuff. So you may consider that going forward.
I think in summary, we could come up with $5 million worth of projects, and that's the
There's no doubt you could.
guidance I gave
Yeah,
Brandon,
right,
just to
exactly.
see. And I would recommend that we don't have to get to that rate anytime very soon. We could wait till we're more clear on what we want to do and when we want to do it, and then have another discussion about going to the highest of the two rates that Brandon has. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would say similar to the water discussion, the depreciation fund helps. I mean, if you're talking about blowers, I don't want to speak for how you guys spend that or whatever, but that's the sort of thing that depreciating funds, it's not really a capital expense. It doesn't take a lot of planning and effort and financing and design and that sort of stuff. You can really, with a relatively small amount of effort, get a project like that done. So I think that's a good use for that as well, and kind of balancing that going forward to forestall, major capital expenditures is, seems to make sense.
Very good. So discussing, we were talking about the bonds that are outstanding, and of course the proposed bonds, that's the $5 million that referred to, and then allowance for working capital and depreciation. Those numbers vary between the two scenarios, but it's basically, as I discussed before, a combination of many things, what you actually spend versus depreciation expense, which would be what you would spend on your books, as well as, a balance of where your capital expenditures are to be, and then as well as where your fund balance is. And here in sewer, there was $27,000 at the end of June for the depreciation fund balance. So while in water, I was a bit concerned that, maybe you guys could go through that in a year or two. If there's no increase and operating costs continue to rise, you see that similar trend here in wastewater. If operating costs continue to rise, and that $27,000 will go very quickly. So I do think that the depreciation funding in wastewater is definitely a lot more crucial, and definitely part of this calculation. We're also looking at bond coverage when we put together these numbers, and that is basically a revenue and expense calculation, looking at your operating revenues and your operating expenses. That gives you the top line, net operating revenues, and then that number needs to be 125% greater than your bond payment. That is laid out in your existing bonds. That's in the bond covenants, or basically the agreement between the bondholders and the bond issuer. That it's called technical default. So where default would be, you didn't pay your bonds, you're in default. But if you don't have this coverage requirement, you're technically in default. And the way that looks is SRF would basically reach out and say, hey, we have analysts that work on this stuff, and they looked at your revenues, expenses. We're seeing some concerns on the coverage. What is the plan to help alleviate this? That would be what would happen. But when I do look at coverage for the end of June, the amount was almost exactly and just barely under 125%. I believe it was 124.6 or 124.7. So what that tells me is through the end of June, just operating right on that minimum margin that you need to be. If we see any increases in operating expenses, then you'll be below that margin, and that would be, against the bond agreement. The rate adjustment here is equal to about 95 cents every year for 11 years in that monthly bill. So, if it had been every 3 or 4 years, and, you divide that by 3 or 4, instead of the 11, but that's kind of the story of how we get from the 41.53 to either 52.02 or 59.57. Again, looking at 4,000 gallons. Here are some comparisons in wastewater bills. Where Tipton's at right now is definitely on the low end, and I think that $52 to $60 range is, I would say, kind of towards the middle. I do think is still very competitive and very on point with other communities. Greenfield and Whitestown or Sharpsville, which I have Sharpsville on both of these. I would imagine that if, there was a Tipton increase to Sharpsville, I would imagine that they would probably need to do some sort of increase as well. Some other ones that stick out here are Sheridan at the very top. They're Indian American sewer treatment, and they're at $103. Franklin, not too far. They're kind of in that $85 range. Again, this is a whole bunch of different communities, but I do think that it does show that $50 to $60 range is probably where you'd end up with these recommendations, and I do think that's very reasonable. Something else to consider too is our firms worked with a lot of wastewater utilities and financings over the last few years, particularly with SRF. They have bumped up their thresholds significantly for grant funding, whereas it used to be maybe $60 or $70 as an average bill. They would say, hey, if you're above this, we might give you some principal forgiveness to buy that down. Now that number is closer to $100. So where a lot of the SRF closings that have happened recently for wastewater for 4,000 gallons are $100 plus. There were a couple that I just didn't put on here because it would have looked very strange. But New Palestine's one, for example, they adopted $136 wastewater fees to afford their project with SRF just last year. So these are kinds of what we're seeing with other communities. Nonetheless, I think in Tipton, you guys are, I would say, definitely ahead of the curve. A lot of utilities we work with don't call us until it's far too late for any help. And nonetheless, we help them. But just wanted to give my insight on a couple of water and wastewater. Just to summarize here, adjustments in water and sewer are a bit unique to each utility, but I think overall themes is increasing operating costs and providing allowances for depreciation funding. The debt service coverage requirements, that 125% metric that I referred to earlier, that's going to be just on the wastewater side. Looking at adjustments to availability fees and connection fees on sewer only, but availability fees on both, and they follow a similar approach, equity based on the number of EDUs on each system. Adjustments to the wholesale wastewater treatment charges, that's going to be Chartsville and Kenton. And also hydrant fees are involved on the water side as well, but we're not included in those comparisons. And then moving forward, we would recommend increases in 2026. These would have to be approved by you all and then the city council. And a phase-in approach is definitely an option that can be considered to reduce initial rate impacts. I think the trade-off in that is the rate increase to the customers versus how much depreciation funding that the utilities want to put away. Any prolonged increase, that's where it's going to cut into that budget. So I would say on the wastewater side, with that very limited depreciation fund, as well as the coverage requirements that are very thin on their operating side, I would think that a phase-in approach might not make as much sense, but there's definitely scenarios we could look at. And then I think on the water side, where you do have a bit of depreciation funding already built up, as we mentioned, not as much on the plant side that is.
I think when the water bond disappeared a year ago,
Yeah, really.
we had already started refunding the depreciation in water,
Mhm.
and we just don't have that option right now in wastewater.
That's true. Yeah. So different considerations to be made for each utility.
So you meant, we have the mayor, obviously, and we have some city council members here as well. We want to give them a preview. I don't think the utility board plans to do anything yet this year, but probably early in 26, we might be headed towards a resolution, making a recommendation to the city. And we have time to make adjustments. We have time to answer questions tonight or after this meeting if things start coming to mind. But I definitely want to give everybody the floor if you had anything that stuck out.
I have some questions. You want me to stand up?
Yeah, introduce yourself so everybody knows.
Nate Crane, City Council President. First question is, how much did the tree cost?
Not our department.
Since we're asking, I may have some questions that I'm not a utility person. So I would start with, if I'm understanding wastewater right, the ask is an increase, which was the Tipton proposed, And then the Tipton bond issue is if we also issued a bond on top of that.
Yes.
That would be the final
So
rate.
yeah, they're kind of two separate scenarios, but they obviously do kind of build off of each other as there's overlapping expenses that would apply to both situations.
And then the depreciation, at a basic level, it's like for every dollar I pay as a ratepayer, so much of that goes into a depreciation fund to pay for capital improvements or whatever's needed.
If the rates are high enough, yes.
Who sets that amount, whether it's like 5 cents on the dollar, 2 cents on the dollar, is it set by code or?
It's less about, what percentage of it is a rate, is more just as each individual piece of the revenue requirements are, at least for let's just talk about wastewater. You got operating expenses, debt service on bonds, coverage on bonds, and then depreciation. So, I mean, there's kind of two ways of thinking about it. It's more just what is a reasonable budget and target to move towards. And then that's kind of where that amount comes up. I mean, there is a bit of flexibility in that amount. But nonetheless, I do believe that that's going to be a crucial part for the depreciation on wastewater, particularly. Just kind of looking at the numbers from a high level, the revenue shortfall in the proposed column is 470,000. So that basically means that all things the same, no increase, 470,000 down the other way. Whereas the allowance for depreciation is 362,000. So what that tells me is even if you got rid of depreciation, as that difference of about 120,000, 130,000, that's going to be basically increases in your operating costs. So,
I think internally, Nate, I can tell you, like on the water, a year and a half ago, Joe Allen said, hey, we used to fund the depreciation and it used to be $10,000 a month.
Mhm.
And we talked back and forth and we knew we were retiring the bond, which was about 150,000 a year going out the door. I said, let's take 10% of that and start funding depreciation. That's when we started having 15 grand. So
So it's a TMU
decision.
decision, not a
Yeah.
council, not an IC code thing.
Yeah, it's with Indiana code. The reason why I put that there is just so that everyone understands that you can pass rates that include depreciation, and that's perfectly acceptable. But what Jim was talking about was the monthly piece, where in an ideal world, you look at this when you're doing a rate study or some sort of financial analysis, and then we say, okay, let's say our target is 120,000 a year. Well, then we're going to make a $10,000 monthly transfer to start building that
That
up.
makes sense. It sounds like that, so from what I heard, the wastewater is kind of operating on the margins.
Yes.
And then a phased-in approach, if we borrow, however much we borrow, whether it's from the state revolving loan fund or something, they may not give us worse terms if they look at our finances.
So the terms that they would give you at SRF probably wouldn't relate as much to the finances, and the reason why is because they're just looking at what they need, and what any lender would need is an ordinance adopted that says, hey, this is our rate increase. If you need one, which most communities who borrow money need some sort of rate increase to afford it, you just have to say, hey, here's our ordinance that's signed, and they can, their internal team can do the calculations, and we also have to provide a parity report and an accounting report that basically supports that, if you do a 20% increase, then you can afford these bonds.
It's collateralized by the increase. essentially.
Yeah, and the coverage requirement is more just about what is outstanding today.
Okay.
However, though, there would be considerations on an open market issue where they might look at some of those different financial metrics, such as
The riskiness.
a local bank. But with SRF, though, I mean, they're issuing so much money, and they have a whole point system that's related, some of it to financial, but also to need of the project, and it looks at a lot on the actual project itself, and kind of what the need is for that. All those points would then say, are you in the fundable range? And then basically it's like that 2.5% rate, or you're not in the fundable range, we can still give you subsidized interest rates because they're issuing loads of money they can get a better credit rating than if Tipton just went to, anywhere and said, what you could do and say, we want to do this project, or they pool, it's called a pool program. They pool together 15, 20 communities, and they all, because of that, they're borrowing more, and so they can kind of get a better rate.
Low risk. Okay, well, is the point, our question. I see we're drastically increasing the connection tap fees and the availability fees. Just an opinion or something to think about for the TMU board is, I kind of remember these from the past when I was at the EDO, and it always seems like they can either be a disincentive sometimes, but almost always whoever the developer was like, well, you guys pay for them. And then it ended up becoming an internal struggle between TMU and usually the then mayor of who's going to pay these, and because it's an incentive that everybody seems to offer. So raising the price may just create more internal strife or disincentivize some development.
Yeah.
But this is something to think about.
And you arrived at your number, Brandon, just based on the market of these other cities and towns that you've dealt with, or?
Yes, it's a financial calculation that most of the time when we put it together, it justifies $5,000 or $6,000 per EDU, and that's not what happened here in Tipton. We did the calculation, and they came out very favorably, reasonably. Usually the conversation I have with utilities is we could justify 6,000, but we're recommending 2,000 because that's going to be much more in line with other communities. I don't have a comparison that's up to date, but I've done one here in the last couple of years where a lot of communities, especially the growing ones, they see the benefit of while there is the other side of it with the disincentivize. There's also the benefit to the utility that before development occurs to get those availability fees up to. You also might hear system development charges. That's a term that's used interchangeably. Basically, to buy into the existing plant. And I think that there's a lot of them around here that are $2,000, $3,000, $4,000. So when I saw $1,350 and $1,750, that didn't surprise me too much. I felt better that knowing that these numbers kind of make more sense to me than a lot of the ones that I see.
That's the kind of thing we can discuss in the city council and say, hey, you know what, we want this rate, or we don't want to change it at all, or we want it.
I would be willing to bet a lot of the communities you mentioned are probably Hamilton County. They're now in a spot where they don't have to waive the fees to get people to build. We're not in that spot.
Right.
We'd love to be in that spot.
That's fair.
Yeah.
So I just don't want to create this internal hurdle. I remember it being kind of heavily discussed, like when the Tipton senior apartments went in, and I think they were initially quoted that each unit needed a tap fee or something, and it just seemed like we're arguing about $250 times 40, and this is a $7 million project.
Yeah.
So
That's a fair point. Thank you, Nate, for that feedback.
I've got two
I'll
questions.
wait for the answer on the Christmas tree, by the way.
Go ahead, Peter.
I've got two questions. I don't know if Jim, you can answer it, or Brandon, maybe you can help. What's the average gallons per day per household per residence that we're consuming?
Well, our house,
Well,
Four
maybe
daughters.
look at low and high. I mean,
4,000 is what we kind of, so electrical is always 1,000 kilowatt hours a month, and water and wastewater is 4,000. And I don't know if that's 4 people or
It's-
Matt, you-
3.5.
it seems low because it's 133
It does
gallons a
seem
day,
low.
and I have no clue because I'm on well and septic. I'm not, just for full disclosure, I guess. So.
Yeah, I think you usually assume, like if you're building a new system, you assume about 100 gallons per day per person, and usually like 3 people per household. If you do the math of 4,000 in 30 days or whatever, it ends up being like 133. So it seems a little low to me. I'm obviously skewed. These numbers are a fantasy to me, so I don't understand anything about that. But yeah, I would say probably if you have a household with 4 or 5 people, they're probably going to be certainly closer to 5,000
Right.
gallons.
Then my second question is, and excuse me for my ignorance on this, is our rate structure flat on water? Like, or is it kind of
Yes, you get charged.
low, higher, and
You
then
get
flatten
charged a
out?
flat fee for all the homes are at 5/8 meter fee. You get that
Yeah.
monthly plus consumption at a flat rate all the way. And then everybody's pretty consistent, but we actually run a report to see if somebody's using more than they should be, and then we report that and we find out, like at the Elks, there's a toilet leak and it's hard to fathom, but a leaky toilet can really cause water use big time. Or even worse if you got a faucet just running all the time. So
Right.
it's a flat, to answer your question.
It's flat fee. So is that even possible, Brandon, maybe to look at some different rate structures? Like for electrical, we have different rates for different customers and
So there
different
are,
usages.
there are there's minimum charges and flow charges, and that's common. To where, depending on how much you use, that's what you're gonna pay. And there's economies of scale in the current structure in water specifically, to where the more you use, the less you're paying per average, which is very common. On the wastewater side, there is a base charge plus a monthly charge per cubic foot or per 100 cubic feet. Then we do a conversion to get that in gallons. And that's going to be $3. Right now it's $3.52 per 100 cubic feet. So however much you use, you're going to pay that $3.52. And then there is a base charge on top of that, which right now is $22.71. So that's how it is right now. And then looking forward, you could definitely consider those types of things. Typically, it doesn't add much value unless we can really prove that there's some sort of inequity in the current customer base, to where maybe you have some large industrial customers that are saying, hey, this doesn't make sense. It's a lot different in electric that we kind of looked at, because there's energy and demand, because it's got to be the usage, and also there has to be charges, or there should be charges that are involved for the maximum capacity. It's something that we can definitely look at. From my experience, it doesn't add a ton of value, in my opinion, because I just think that the revenues are what they are and the expenses are what they are, and if there's a lot of inequity in who's paying what, then that's where kind of cost of service comes in, and that's where you kind of start to look at some of those different types of scenarios. But I do think that when I see your charges, I'd say for wastewater, base plus one rate block for usage, that's very common. And then on the water side, where the more you use, the less it costs, and then a minimum charge associated with that, that's also very common as well. There are communities that have flat fees where truly it's I believe Sharpsville has just a fee. So here's your water fee and here's your sewer fees. It doesn't matter how much you use.
So
They pay
I
the same amount.
misspoke. We do have a ramp down if you use a lot more water. And that's in the first 300 cubic feet, the next 1,300, the next 6,400. It's on that rate sheet.
I think that the way it is now is probably the most equitable, but there definitely could be situations where.
Well, my thought is to keep it low for smaller households, ramp it up and then flatten it out, or,
Usually people see it the other way. If I'm going to use more, I should get a better rate.
well, to a point, right? But,
It's definitely an option, it would just require lots of digging in the data, but, kind of making changes to those rate blocks is certainly an option. But to me, my personal opinion is that I don't think it adds much value, but it's easier for me to say just someone who looks at the numbers and not someone who pays the bills or has to answer to the people who pay the bills.
If I may too, there's also, do you guys have a minimum charge per meter size? So like if you have
On water, yes, and on sewer, it's a base charge.
yeah, so like if you have like a commercial user that has a 2-inch meter instead of 5/8 meter, their base charge is higher, whereas their consumption charge is low, or their consumption charge will be lower on average. So it kind of works both directions. And the purpose for that is kind of similar to the electric, like, if you need to provide a short-term demand for a 2-inch meter, that's why their base rate is higher, so that you can, so that your water mains and plant and storage and stuff is sized for those higher uses. So it really works in both directions. It's just the base rate is higher, the bigger of a user you are, and the average rate is lower.
It also begs the question of fixed costs and variable costs, to where those minimum charges, if I just did a quick calculation, the 302 cubic feet times 7.48, which I believe is the conversion to cubic feet to gallons, is about 2,200 gallons. So a lot of communities that I see with a minimum charge is usually 2,000. So that's very common. But it does kind of beg the question of fixed and variable charges, which is a whole rabbit hole of information. But just to kind of sum it up, those minimum charges and base charges, as we mentioned, are definitely going to be related to fixed charges, whereas variable, then it kind of, there's that economies of scale. But this is all right up my alley, and happy to talk about stuff.
Mayor, any questions?
Only to offer to Peter's question that my family's consumption is far less than 4,000. I don't know if this is an issue. I don't want you to. But my kids are also in their prime as water consumers either.
They're taking baths, right?
Yeah, so there's Matt on the other side of that, just finding their prime water consumption.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would say from a family of 4,
Yep.
we fall well below that 4,000.
Even when I was watering my brand new grass every day, I was under the 4,000.
We got the notice that Jim was talking. So,
We got one. Didn't we?
Yeah.
We got the
Got a
one.
leak under your fence?
Yeah, we had no idea. And he's like, did you know?
It's funny.
Councilman Joe, any questions for us this evening? Or
Well, since you asked. Keep in mind that, well, first of all, none of this is under the authority of the RURC, right?
Correct.
Correct.
And just to bring up, and I'm sure Rick remembers this, it was a 4-1 vote. Former Councilman Havens was the dissenting vote, and his thoughts were who's going to represent the ratepayer. And I think that was a legitimate, I'm always baffled by accountants and lawyers because they baffle me. I understand that the water department has no debt.
Yes,
Okay.
it's paid off.
No outstanding bond there at all.
Correct.
Then, and you may not know this, maybe it's an unfair question for you, but I think and don't take this question as an opinion. A lot of people make questions and their opinions. What's the water company worth?
I would say that the water company is probably worth, I would say, the plant value, and then maybe make some other adjustments for maybe backing out expenses that there's overlapping expenses that if there was no water plant, you'd still have to pay certain salaries and benefits and things like that, and administrative expenses. So I would think that, yeah, I'd probably want to add that to the amount. So, do you want me to give you a dollar figure?
Well, I've thought about this. And I guess I would ask, are you asking, and I'm not trying to go down a rabbit hole, but are you asking if you were to sell it, how much would it cost?
What's it worth? Yeah.
Okay, there's 2 different ways to think about it. Or are you saying if the town of Tipton needed a whole new water system, how much would it cost to build it? You're asking how much would it pay. I don't know, but my guess would be a company that would come in and say, how much profit can they make on rates over 20 years or whatever, and I don't know what that would be. I can tell you what it would cost to replace everything.
And I'm not advocating that, but I think it's part of the equation. Westfield thought it was part of the equation, right? They built Grand Park with it.
Yeah, they
as
sold it.
as I understand, right?
Sheridan thought it was part of the equation. Now you see what their ratepayers are being asked to,
Okay.
highest in wastewater and.
I'm not,
No, but there's a multiple.
I'm not here to argue about that, but I think it's important to understand. The only other thing that I saw today, when I looked at Gateway, and to me it's problematic, because working for a utility for 33 years, is, and I know this is small potatoes to the whole scheme of things. But I noticed there's $160,007 obligation to the water and wastewater for unpaid sick days as of January 1st. I just don't understand that. It's calculated at a lower rate. Now it's gonna be paid out at a higher rate. Every place I ever worked, it was use it or lose it. Just an opinion. That's all I got.
Good feedback. Thank you.
I think when this does, if and when it does come to the council, just similar to what we did with electric, kind of to Joe's point.
Yeah.
Or the trash. Our alternatives are very few. We either make this work or we sell. Well, people won't like if we sell the trash. It'll go up by 3 or 4 fold and you won't get recycling when you go with the yard waste. So really the question is, how are we comparative? That's what I always care about. That, yeah, you can keep rates low forever, but then you can't. Eventually you'll have to sell because you'll be out of business. So it's always, to me, how are we competitive? And these show we're still very competitive with the rate increases. We can't keep them the same forever. That'll be something the council has to hopefully really think about and consider. Again, we don't want to raise rates, but the reality is costs go up. So many times.
And it would be our ongoing goal to review these a little more frequently, where it's, Brandon was talking about the minuscule annual increases, where those would be a little bit more relevant in shorter chunks. So smaller chunks.
This to sell the water or any part of the utilities, it'd probably be bought by someone like IAW, like Indiana Water, and it would go from 26 to 50 something. And I don't think people would like that too much. So I mean, yes, we don't take increases lightly, but they are what they are, and the alternatives are not better. Tough decisions. I think we did our first rate increase when Rick and I, was that the electric?
I can't.
We never did one before then.
Yeah, and how long's that been?
I don't know, we're just the council raising
coming
taxes.
up on
2 years.
Yeah. Just two?
So electric is in good shape.
Yeah, the thing with electric is that whereas water and sewer, you have your own plants, with electric, probably, I don't know from you, but I'm gonna guess 80% or more of your cost is just buying from IMPA. So there's a tracking factor mechanism, which so basically where I'm doing a cost calculation of just, local costs of water and sewer. That's kind of the trend that you see is every handful of years, you would need an increase in water and sewer, whereas electric, it was a 20-year change. But the thing is, the tracker had gone up to almost 5 cents per kilowatt hour, which is $50 for 1,000 kilowatt hours. So basically, for 20 years, part of your bill increased $50 to cover up purchase power, but then the other part of it is what kind of needed to catch up. And then we all got rolled into one rate and synchronized. But that's kind of what's going on with electric.
I do have a question, maybe for Jim. Electric is just pass through, right? And there's just a margin. And the margin is the profit locally. How do you guarantee, how does IMPA guarantee that rate for so much time? Because you've got a rate that you have to, that you put out.
But as Brandon mentioned, the biggest part of what IMPA provides us on the purchase power is the cost of producing that power. So if natural gas there's a big world war somewhere and natural gas goes through the roof, they quickly pass that on to us. We quickly pass that on to ratepayers
What do you mean quickly, that you have to do that?
quarterly.
Every quarter.
You don't,
have to
so
do-
you have the opportunity to
Yes.
change the rate every quarter.
It has been happening ever since you've been,
Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
yes.
Yeah, we don't have to do an ordinance or anything.
Yeah, that, I don't know when that went into effect. My guess is sometime, a long time ago, they had to do that officially through ordinance, and it got tiresome, and they came up with a
I
solution.
think it goes back to when Buzz was probably first starting, early 1980s. Is when the tracking.
Well, that's
factor-
when IMPA was started.
Yeah, that's when the tracking factor mechanism.
But it can go down as well,
And it
correct?
did go down
Yeah.
last year.
Mhm.
Yeah. We had negative.
Every year, probably around, well, just this month or last month, IMPA will provide their rates for next year and give that to all the communities. And it's actually me who puts together your tracking factor report every quarter for the last 3 years. And I believe Cronin Associates has been doing it probably since the late 90s. And then we account for the rates that they provide to us, and then there's estimates that are involved, and then that goes through every quarter, and then every July they might have a tracking change on their end. So basically, IMPA suppliers, they have a tracker, and then IMPA passes that on to Tipton and their tracker. So while there's the base charge, the base charges of the IMPA bill for energy and demand, they also have a tracker that they pass on. I believe for the all of last year, it was a large credit amount, so it was actually a negative, driving down the rates that ultimately your customers had to pay. But every quarter that gets changed and it's accounted for. And then something else with the tracker is that not only does it look forward for the next quarter, it also reconciles from the previous quarter. So what that means is, while you have the rates and charges for what's to come, we also are able to compile the data from, I'm going to work on the January, February, March tracker. I'm going to reconcile July, August, September. So say, hey, maybe we overshot it by 20,000 or under 20,000. That gets rolled into the next one. So then it's basically always correcting itself. And that's also kind of part of it too.
Very good. Anything else from the board? Questions for Brandon, comments, concerns? Audience, Matt, anything else? Bob?
I don't have any comments, but I do know how much the tree was. I look at people on Facebook just wondering.
Well, I'm just glad that Jim and this board is looking at this sooner than later, and so that any increase that incur, we're gonna keep them small, rather than telling somebody, oh, we're gonna raise your bill $20.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. That is the future goal as we roll along. So with that, I'll
Second.
have a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it, Brandon.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Thank
Good information.